In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head, two therapists talking about how capitalism impacts mental health. My name's Max, and we are going to do a bit of an identity wrap-up today because we've had a couple episodes over the last month that are about identity politics. Maybe it was interesting, maybe it was controversial or offensive to some people, the directions we took. But we decided we want to kind of wrap up this topic, so we talked about it a lot. But before we get into it, Harriet's going to kick it off for us. But before we forget, wanted to give our big shout out to patrons First Winter, Sarah Turner,
Yay.
Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila MC Manga. And as always, thank you to Liam for the editing. It's very hard work. And that is all I have to say. Harriet, what do you have to say?
Well, identity politics has been a hallmark of American politics since the 70s. And on the one hand, it was a deliberate CIA, FBI effort to divide what could have been a class-unified movement against capitalism into divisive racial and gender categories, so that the CIA and the FBI in the Operation Great Wurlitzer funded Gloria Steinem, CIA agent, and several others in the Black movement to make sure that the women's movement was a gender-only movement that did not relate to class, and that the movement for civil rights was a Black power movement that did not relate to class, and that in fact, they were divisive. So Gloria Steinem says a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, and that men are the problem rather than our collusion with men around our own inferior status is a problem, or that race is a problem and whitey's out to get you, rather than we're both part of a racial injustice system that divides us and conquers all of us. Very different emphases. And what was lost was the identity that was so powerful during the movements of the 1880s, the identity as a worker, the identity of somebody who depends on a wage to make a living. In the 50s, it was pushed, the middle class. You identify as middle class, which means you are above the poor, even though, of course, you're above the very rich, rather than that you need to work to live, and you're different from the boss. Right now, CEOs make about on average, 340 times the salaries of the people of whose organizations they are the CEO, and the board of directors are even richer. And so the identity as worker, which unlike the identities as woman or as brown or as Black or as gay or as queer, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, the identity as a worker is a unifying identity, not to put down those other identities. They're all important. It's important for every human being who has been taught in the myriad ways we are taught that our standing is as a subordinate to the dominant. So women are to serve men, to please men. Black people are to serve in more menial roles and are encouraged to do so. Hispanics, the same. People who are gender different are to feel that they are wrong, that somehow they didn't get it right. They're outliers. They need correction therapy, as the right wing would give them, because there's something wrong about that lifestyle. And there's something very liberating in realizing that your subordinate status which you have kept to, not because of the cops necessarily outside or the army, but because you felt you ought to cringe. You ought to just please the other. You ought to be subservient. Those identities need to be rejected, and people need to claim those identities as a badge of power. So women can claim, I am a woman, I have power, I have possibility, I have might, I can join with other women, but also I am a worker. I can join with other workers to make this society work for the people who do the work in it, which is a unifying agenda. I often think of the poster I saw in the Women's Liberation Office when I went to give a talk. And they had just recently taken the first American astronaut to the moon. And it said they took one man to the moon, now they can take the rest of them, which was cute, but it does reject half the human race. And we're not going to win if we reject a huge number of the human race. Blacks are not going to win without white people, brown people, Asian people, all people behind them. It's why Martin Luther King said the best strategy for racial equality is organizing into unions. And he said that when he was talking to the Longshoremen's Union, because in the 1800s, one of the things that really busted up the labor movement is they discriminated against and excluded Black workers who were eagerly hired as strikebreakers when there was a strike. And then that was used to make Blacks and whites continue to hate one another rather than to have unions like the Longshoremen's to say, hey, they can be hired because as strikebreakers because they're desperate. They're excluded from good jobs like ours. Let's welcome an interracial movement. And so we have identification as workers and worker power, which is really marginalized in American society. People aren't proud to be a metal worker or factory worker or a waitress or a childcare worker. They're not proud to be workers that keep this system going, that are the essential people, labeled essential so that they could be forced out of their houses into their jobs, to feed this country, to care for people. And so what we are really trying to do here is encourage one's identity in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sex, in terms of ethnicity, and at the same time, remember that we all need each other and we can all identify as workers who need to support other workers because we're all in it together. It's one of the reasons why workers in Germany and France got 70 to 90% of their salaries when they had to stop their jobs because of the pandemic. The government paid 70 to 90% of their salaries as long as the employer was sworn to take them back when the pandemic was gone, to take them back in their same position. We don't have that power because our unions don't have that connection as workers. A connection with when one union is on strike, the others are sympathetic. So when in Germany, the metal workers, which I'm fond of saying this, won a 22-hour work week for home-life balance, they did so because when all 300,000 of them approximately were on strike, they also got the transit workers to be on strike, the oil company workers to be on strike, and so on, the teachers. That's what labor solidarity is because you all identify as workers. And that's what they have successfully suppressed. They have repressed that a lot more than they've repressed racial identity or sexual identity. or gender identity in the United States. And that's what we need to bring back. It was reintroduced in 2011 with the Occupy movements, which the liberal brown Obama destroyed on the same day across this country to keep capitalism alive and keep people from identifying with part of the 99% rather than the 1%, which is what they introduced in the 3 short months of their powerful existence. And that's what our labor movement has missed out on by the anti-communist purges of the 50s, throwing out the labor activists around the unity of workers, the communists, the socialists, and all other leftists. And that's what we need. We need an identity politics that includes our unifying identities as workers with the other identities that liberates us from a sense of necessary internal subordination, of knowing our place beneath others. That's what Max and I feel so strongly about. And we differ from our speaker and guest, from Angie Speaks, who puts down all identity politics. Identity politics are liberating. We just need to include the Unitarian identities as workers to that identity. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, and I agree with that because I wouldn't put down Angie. I know you're not putting her down. I actually, because this is what sparked the conversation for anyone that listened to our Angie Speaks interview last time, which I thought was great. I mean, the two of you kind of went at it, like kind of debated. I actually see value in even what is pejoratively called the class reductionist left. And I see value in a certain kind of identity politics, but there's certain kinds that I just think have just gone a totally, co-opted, like corporate, whatever direction. So one thing I wanted to do for today, because this is our sort of identity wrap up, like let's wrap it up. We had Assad Haider, who's critical of identity politics in a different way than Angie Speaks. We had Angie Speaks. She has that far harder kind of polemical, just in your face way of talking about it. But, so we're therapists, we have a background in psychology, and I figured, something we haven't done a whole lot. I think I went over this a little bit in one of our first episodes, talking about Black Lives Matter and basically racial identity development. I'm not going to give some big lecture on it, but the concept of identity itself is something that I think is lost in the identity politic discussion, like in the mainstream liberal discussions. There's just this, I'm an X, you're a Y, and now we're arguing about lived experiences and stuff. But just to kind of like drill down and understand the more basic concept of identity, and then to kind of build up from there. Because here's where I'm going to say, I think there's such vital importance to understanding what identity is and how people form what we call a self-concept, this sort of self-view of who they are, and then where that does and doesn't move into like any kind of politics, or where I think like it should and maybe shouldn't, or where it can become almost harmful or just like a distraction. So everyone's born as this little baby, that comes out of a womb and doesn't actually have a sense of identity. There has not yet been developed any sense of self-concept. There's no language. There's no social influence yet. I mean, moment by moment, there are social influences that are shaping an infant into someone that might articulate a sentence: I am X, I am an X, I am a Y. I feel strongly affiliated with X, Y, and Z. But so everyone is born, maybe blank slate is like a controversial statement, so I won't say that. But everyone's born close to a blank slate. And then over time, their families and their societies around them shape them into having what we call an identity. So if we did actually live in a society without racism, sexism, homophobia, we wouldn't be talking about this, because no baby would be born into self-concepts that have distorted, overly exaggerated positive self-concepts. Like maybe if you have a straight white guy that just walks into a room and thinks everyone should listen to what he has to say. He has great ideas because everywhere he's looked in his life, white guys just are, controlling things or whatever. Or a black woman that walks into a room and just internalize this idea that I might need just to kind of sit quietly because people may not listen to what I have to say, tell me to shut up, be hostile, think I'm angry when I'm talking, or take my ideas and not credit me, kind of thing. And those are the white guy and the black woman thing I just gave, those are sort of stereotypical, general, cultural experiences that you can, there's actually there's some quantitative data if you want to get nerdy, and I'm not going to cite sources. I'm just going off of what I've absorbed over the years. But how is it that you would have such vastly different internal and what are called lived experiences between, say, like a white guy that thinks that way about himself, consciously or unconsciously, and maybe a black woman who. So you have to think like through the trajectory of their life, through the development of them from being infants to full-fledged adults that walk around in the world, having jobs, having families, just living kind of ordinary lives. Why would there be such vast differences? And that really does have to go back to that there are historical reasons for that, which I do think the modern kind of liberal identity politic world tends to not do. Like, we don't talk about the history of the formation of capital in Europe, from the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and the sort of colonialism and imperialism projects that the European merchant class engaged in after the feudal system devolved, and the role in which the state, which is a sort of center of power where you use a military through paying and highly incentivizing and kind of psychologically brainwashing in some ways, you get that military as the enforcement mechanism to control markets for inroads for a better quality of life and absolute total control, or as much control as possible, for a ruling class. And then you just go from there. And the kinds of, Harriet has articulated this far better than I could, but when we talk about things like identities from, like, say, black identity or woman identity or gay identity or trans identity or whatever, these what we call identities are shaped by those historical factors that do get kind of wrapped up into what we'll call maybe structural or systemic or institutionalized fabrics of society that then create kind of this twofold thing. One is this sort of external to the self. There are messages that say you are blank, you are smart, you are stupid, you are ugly, you are beautiful, you are whatever. And then so from the outside of you internalize these ideas about yourself. So those are the kinds of terms you might hear sometimes: internalized sexism, internalized racism, and so on. And those, so what I think is important, I think from the so-called class reductionist or the anti-woke kind of left, that and I've pendulumed into that a lot over the years as well. So just to sort of admit maybe wrongdoing, I've probably made comments on this podcast sometimes where I'm like rolling my eyes about identity politics. So, apologies for anyone that I may have offended with that. But what I think is lost in that sort of anti-woke, let's roll our eyes at all this stupid, Robin DiAngelo and Tim Wise that are just sort of, they seem to have a sort of ahistorical and often apolitical, or definitely not like a material analysis. They certainly don't have any kind of that kind of thing going on. However, the total validity, and the thing that I think is lost sometimes, is that granular sense of psychology, which can be overemphasized for sure, but that any individual, I'll actually give an example. I'll give actually two clinical examples as like little case studies. So Black client and lesbian client that I have right now. Black client is extremely concerned right now that their child won't have access to a Black community here in Santa Barbara because there are, there's not a lot of Black people in Santa Barbara. Now, why would this parent care? Like, who cares? Whatever. Our children are blank slates, and just make sure that they have all their needs met and everything. Well, because this parent knows that their kid might actually internalize a lot of negative things about their own racialized identity that society is going to impose on them, regardless of what they try to teach their kid. Mm-hmm. But if they have access to and experiences with a more resilient and positive culture of Black people who do see themselves in a positive light and are like functional and so on, the child is a lot more likely. He just kind of understands this intuitively as a parent. He didn't sit around reading all these child developmental books or something, but he kind of knows intuitively that if the kid lacks that, it's going to be a little bit confusing. The ideas of what a Black person is are going to come from the outside of that kid and internalize into that kid and actually make things a lot harder for that kid to feel like they belong in society. So it's a sort of mitigating factor if that kid can actually have a positive self-concept reinforced by an immediate kind of Black culture that they can be in, and like a positive Black culture. Alternatively, lesbian client of mine who just came out kind of recently, it occurred to me in all the work we've been doing for the last few months that so many of what we would call in like the symptom and medical model of psychology, these symptoms of depression and PTSD and anxiety and social anxiety, and they fit probably a handful of DSM diagnoses. That finally, when they finally came out to me, and I thought about all these all the trauma experiences and the social anxiety and everything, and I realized, holy shit, your sexual orientation and your gendered identity, and both of those two things wrapped up in sort of gender and sexual orientation, are actually are, not to be too reductive about this, but they actually are at the center of the majority of your psychological suffering. And this has been true for you for at least a decade, maybe two. And because of the fact that there was no support, that there was only negative and stigmatizing and harmful messages about who this person was. And there's a lot of other factors. I wouldn't say the sexual orientation thing is not 100% who the person is. And that's that reductive, I think, the reductive harm that we can do in saying, well, all the person is a lesbian, all the person is a woman or whatever. But the moment the person came out, they felt a little, and hopefully my response was affirming enough, right? That's kind of the whole thing. Somebody comes out and you gotta celebrate it, right? You don't go, oh, I don't know, that's weird. That's the whole problem, right? But once this person, if and when this person integrates themselves into a positive and affirming sort of social grouping that says yay to lesbians, yay to LGBT and queer folks and everything, they're going to be able to get unstuck from where they've been in life to then make something of their life that they want to. Now, here's where I think the problem is in identity stuff, because in the mainstream liberal kind of discourse on this stuff, I think where people would stop is to say, yeah, so, get liberated. And this is the co-optation of radical language, right? Where say we want all people to be liberated. And so we want like this Black kid and this lesbian woman to become liberated psychologically as individuals, right? Like that's key, as individuals, so they can do what? Just live a fulfilling life, because we're all just individuals trying to live our best individual lives. To me, that's actually where the kind of, to me, that's actually where the problem is. This is my bias, right? As a therapist, I would never say, okay, great, now you're better. Now go join, some communist group or something. Like, I'm not going to say that to people. But I think if from that point forward, you're like, oh, great, I'm over all my shit that came from society stigmatizing me and telling me that I'm the piece of trash because of all this historical nonsense and oppression and violence. Well, now I'm just going to go live, quote unquote, a normal life and try to just maximize my individual pleasure as a person. Now, I'm not saying like, well, you're not allowed to do that. Of course you're allowed to do that. But I think that's again, under capitalism, if the system is still going to be rooted in, at its foundation, the exploitation of the vast majority of human beings through the exploitation of their labor and the infinite destruction of our natural resources, and people's goals are simply to sort of get over to feel better as individuals, instead of saying I hate myself because I'm gay. Now it's like, now I'm marching in all the pride parades and I really love myself. I guess I'm just saying, I'm sorry guys, but that's actually not enough. Like, yes, there are, for some people, there's a greater level of oppression based on all these complex historical and structural problems, but and I think this goes back to what you're saying, Harriet, in that the worker identity. And I don't know if I 100%, I know what you're saying, and I do think that is good. But if at a certain point if you're capable, once you get to the point where like your depression and your self-hatred and all the stigma and all the internalized crap, once you've kind of managed that and you can cope with it, and it's either gone or you've replaced it with a healthy self-concept. My message to you personally is like, we need you in a movement that's not just strictly in this compartmentalized identity world, because it's not enough to create a world. We can't transform the world into the kind of world that actually works for everybody. Like, you might be able to say so abstractly, like these concepts of like, well, if you pull up single, Black, transgender, disabled women, then like all people get lifted up. I actually disagree with that. I don't think that actually makes logical sense, because you could do that for a handful of X people. That doesn't mean anything for anybody else. Like, if a CEO can still make 1,000 times more money off of someone that's a janitor in the corporation, and such person now maybe like owns a home and they won the lottery or something, that doesn't help anybody but that individual. So,
And even so, it misses a basic contradiction. The basic divisions in society in ancient times, after the early communist period where people cooperated or they would have died, they didn't have the power to be living on their own. They were the master and the slave. Those were the big divisions. Then they were the serf and the lord. Then they are the employer and the employee. And unless you face that basic division, you're really missing something.
Well, in landlord tenant, in the tenant organizing I'm doing these days, two examples, just really briefly. One example, and this is again where this is just, it's so easily pitted against us on the left now, when people just are very uncritically into the identity conversation. Where, so in the Bay Area, I know of a group called TANK, stands for Tenant and Neighborhood Councils. Really, I think, awesome radical group. They have picked some fights with some landlords in the Bay Area, in the East Bay. I think it might be Oakland. And as everybody knows, there's a lot of Black people in Oakland. And a lot of the tenant organizers have just sort of, it's almost like a natural process where they're having to go after Black landlords, just because since there's a lot of Black people, there's like a lot more Black landlords than you might have in like a less sort of Black concentrated city. Yeah. But the landlord lobby has now gone after Tank, saying, look at these racist white anarchists or whatever. Right. So they're actually weaponizing identity, when again, it's like, we're actually, what they're fighting is the class contradiction between landlord tenant. That actually is the issue. But it's unfortunately, I think the mainstream kind of uncritical, because like we can't even have debates anymore. Like, we can't, well, I disagree with that. Actually, I don't know about that. Like, let's debate, let's discuss this, instead of like, now I'm terrified you're going to like, cancel me or publicly shame me or I'll lose friends. Is that we actually have to have more critical conversations about this. Is it racist for a mostly white tenant association in Oakland, California, to engage in direct action, like doing a phone zap against a Black landlord who owns 50 properties and is letting all the buildings fall into disrepair? Is that racist? In my opinion, no. I think that's that's class struggle going
after him because he's Black.
Well,
and it's not only going after the Black landlords, you're going after the big landlords.
And most of them are going to be white landlords, but it's another one of those things where it's like the landlord lobby, regardless of their racial makeup, and it's right now it's going to be mostly white, but like, let's say in 20 to 50 years, like every landlord lobby now has perfect representation of every quote unquote identity in the city, that they have trans landlords and Black landlords and whatever, and they're all equally exploiting the living shit out of every tenant and and mass evicting every tenant of every identity. And that's, I mean, I feel like for anyone that's sort of in the kind of like left, your algorithms feed you the kinds of things I just said, it's not surprising to you, but we actually can't have these kinds of conversations in a lot of spaces, because it actually is like really prickly still. Where like, me as a white guy saying this for, again, understandable historical reasons, where it's like, well, look at this white guy talking like this or whatever. But look, it's like the tenant landlord, the employer employee relationship stuff. That's really like, we can't, part of, I think, I don't know as much about the mighty Wurlitzer stuff as you, Harriet, from that book, but I don't, whether it's intentional or not, I don't know, from the CIA, the FBI, whatever the hell, or just like capital interests. I don't know if this was on purpose or not, but it just notice how easy it is for us to try to get into these discussions and then watch it veer into a kind of never ending conflict around identity that results in everyone in the discussion feeling exhausted and angry and distrustful toward each other. And then people not working together anymore. When again, if it's like we're united as tenants, we're united as workers, or whatever the sort of the economic base is, this is not a class reductionist thing that I'm saying. I'm saying it actually is just, it's actually an easier, quicker way toward unification because you actually just, the numbers are there. There's just more numbers.
Right.
There's a lot more tenants than landlords, a lot more workers than bosses. It's just sort of a logistical, like, it's not a shortcut. But like from that, if we did see ourselves, if that were integrated more, maybe not centrally, because again, like my lesbian client, she's going to centrally see herself as a lesbian for quite a long time, I believe.
Yes,
like not so much as a worker. Her whole thing's not going to be like, I'm a worker. So like
be a lesbian worker, and that's very important. So she doesn't not join the work to have a union at her job because she's only a lesbian. She's not a worker. She's a lesbian worker.
Yeah.
And there has to be room.
Yeah.
And I think you can use anything for whatever purpose. And the point is to divide. So Corbyn, the socialist Labour Party in England, was brought down by accusations by his right wing of anti-Semitism. Israel goes against anyone who looks at its apartheid treatment of Palestinians and says they're an anti-Semite. So they use what is an important movement against anti-Semitism to parry the thrusts and cover their settler colonialist policies in Palestine. That these identitarian movements are liberating, but they can also be used to divide and conquer.
And I think it's hard in the current moment. I think it's just still hard. I mean, I think the sort of the armor of the fake way it's used is being kind of broken up. Like I'm seeing more critical conversations outside of the so-called class reductionist online left, which is refreshing, but I mean, I think it's just occurring to a lot more people. I mean, even where I worked in the community mental health setting where we had our, I'm not going to go into the long story, but so most of the Latino women coworkers near the bottom of the chain with me, that we would have conversations about all the newly hired Latino middle management. We would kind of roll our eyes about, when the CEO was like saying like intersectional diversity hiring and stuff, and they were just like, yeah, like they turned so-and-so into a boss, and now we got to kind of like, and like they got it. Like we didn't need to get into this like abstract identity politics conversation. Like they understood like, yeah, they're paying that person 3 times as much of us to like breathe down our necks. And in that moment, they didn't see themselves. I mean, actually I did have conversations where like the Latinos, the Latino workers and the Latino managers, like they were happy. They're like, oh, well, it is cool that we actually have like some Latino managers for once. There's only ever been white managers here. So they did feel like, maybe there'll be some of the micro level things actually might shift a little bit, which is cool, right? That there won't be those like, because this is the other piece that I do think I probably kind of steamroll over this sometimes, and I do think it's been overblown, but the microaggression thing, where like me and Harriet we probably said and done things in our lives where, because in our own identity formation, we probably have internalized things like white is better and not white is worse or whatever. And so we might actually have like subtle facial expressions or cut someone off when they're talking or do these like subtler things that actually can like psychologically be corrosive for someone that is in a sort of not the dominant cultural position. And so, and the reason I say I think it's overblown is I think that, again, like once our selective focus in quote unquote politics is on that, then it's like, well, there's not, it's really hard to actually go. Well, plus you're starting to look for it, right? Like I've had experiences where, I've had my share of shut up white man things. It's fine. I have pretty thick skin on it. But at this point, it's hard because sometimes I can't tell like when I'll hear people say like, oh, I'm being gaslit by white people and stuff, like I have actually felt like I'm being gaslighted because I'm like, I
Well,
didn't
of course you
actually,
can
I
be.
didn't say that thing. I actually didn't say the thing. So you saying that like me as the white man saying the thing, like I'm like, you're bringing up a thing I actually didn't say and you're saying a white. So I'm like, it just feels so, so high conflict.
And
And
it's so divisive. You don't, also, there are a lot of microaggressions that have nothing to do with race or gender, but are people's working off their stuff. And if you're trolling for insults, you're not going to look for a unifying force that will win. And
but yeah.
Americans have the least class consciousness of any Europeans, and therefore we are the least well off in terms of our ability to fight for workers' rights.
But I do think though, to go back, to almost contradict myself a little bit, or maybe push back on that, is that, well, yes to all that. But so a story from a union organizer friend also in the Bay Area told me recently that there was this big kind of fallout. They have a lot of what they call DEI, diversity, equity, inclusivity conversations in their union. And I mean, she has mixed feeling. I mean, she's like brown, like from India originally, and like darker skin, whatever. She actually got into labor organizing through the DEI stuff. She initially was just really into the identity stuff, and then somehow it moved her into labor organizing, and then she actually cared about identity politics less. But now the conversations we have is she's like, we really like very skillfully need to integrate both and like not pendulum to either side in an extreme way. And something that she, like an example she gave me was that they're on the executive board of the union, it is mostly white people, and eventually they like intentionally said like we need more diversity, and so they like got this like black woman on the executive board, and there's been like some kind of drama around sort of microaggression things in there. But the sort of the problem is, I think, or no, here's a better example. She was saying that recently there was, I think, a Latina woman in the union that did a bunch of things, and then something just like there was so much conflict and she left. And then a few of the white organizers started like picking up where she left off and basically using all her ideas. She was never credited. And like so this narrative of like women of color being erased or women's labor being erased, she was saying like she watched this happen in real time. And she said all the things that the identity politic people say and sometimes seem like they're exaggerating or are just being like overboard with. She said, like, I watched it actually happen exactly as people say that it happens. Like, she actually did all the work. No one recognized the work. She tried to bring up that there were these sort of microaggression type of things happening. And then the white, union labor organizer guys who, after it's not like they push her out, but she felt so unwelcome and so unrecognized that eventually, like, everything she did was just completely erased. Like, it will never go down in history that there was this woman of color that did this thing. And again, you might say, like, well, who cares who did the thing?
Well,
like, who
it
gives
is
a shit?
important to recognize
Exactly. It is important because then again, it's that micro psychological piece where if the next woman of color that's maybe considering going into a sort of leadership role there, if she doesn't see any representation, like, so if she did see representation, she's like, oh, there's this other Latina woman. It's just an automatic thing where like you see yourself and then you're a little bit, it gives you probably a tiny boost, maybe a big boost of confidence to say, oh, I will be welcome here.
Yes, it does. However, one of my first big political educations was when I was a school teacher in New Haven, Connecticut. We had a drunken white principal. The school was 99% black. The neighborhood was 99% black. There was a lot of racism among the teachers. And there were only two white teachers. One of them was the wife of an establishment minister who didn't want to have anything to do with any confrontation around anything. And the other one went along with that one. So me and 5 other white teachers went with the cooperation of the registrar. We got the names. We went door to door, explained to the parents why their children were not getting an education. And the parents went on strike, and the city replaced the principal with a black principal that shut the parents up and continued a highly inferior education and tried to get rid of those white teachers that had challenged the system because he thought, whoa, they got rid of one principal who's corrupt, I'm next. And that was a wonderful education in the uses and abuses of race, because the problem wasn't race. The problem was the principal was, he was racist. He was also drunk and incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
And parents weren't part of the running of the school and the participation in the school. And as I went door to door talking to the Black parents, I remember this one guy, I said, come to this meeting at the school. He said, if I go into that school, I'm going to kill somebody. So I'm not going. And I said, good idea. Stay home then.
Mm-hmm.
We'll let you know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But movements can be subverted, like the Socialist Labor Party candidate through the right wing, accusing him of anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
These are tools that could be used to liberate or to enslave.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that's very important, particularly in the United States, in which class is the most repressed discourse, it isn't race, it isn't gender, it's class. That we have to see it as an important unifier without which we're never going to win on a mass scale. We're not going to change the culture. And we're not going to change basics, like in fairy tales you read to children. There was a fair young maid. Wait a minute, it should be there was a dark young maid. Or there were several young maidens, fair and dusky, whatever. And in order to get ahead, the princess, the prince who was once despised and lowly marries the princess and becomes the king, rather than saying, redistribute the wealth of this kingdom. Let everyone have a decent life. It's so riddled in the culture. And we can root it out, but the we has to be a connected we, the mass of people, or we just won't win. We just won't. In a rent strike, if only the white people are on strike, forget it, or only the blacks.
Right.
We need everyone. And that's what they want to destroy. And that's what we have to. And I do agree with Angie on this, although I don't agree with her reductionist dismissal of it all. But we have to build a class movement, because that's what we don't have in the US.
Right.
And that liberating factor of someone who felt, it's my fault that I don't have money. I had a client like this.
Mm-hmm.
It's my fault. I'm a failure. He lost his job and his whole family started treating him like a failure.
Mm-hmm.
His kids only looked to his wife when he said something was wrong. And then when she agreed with him, they obeyed, otherwise they didn't. Because as an unemployed man, he was disgraced. And he blamed him. He wasn't part of a movement of the unemployed, a class-based movement.
So here's an example. Here's a note on solidarity, because it's something I've been thinking about a ton lately in the tenant union I work in, or volunteer. It feels like a job because I do so much. But so solidarity. There's this concept. This will come back to identity in a moment. But so there's this phrase. It'll get thrown around. Solidarity, not charity, right? So what this means is the charity model of change is you get people that have, say, money or power or whatever, and they charitably, kindly give to the downtrodden, right? So that's charity. Charity doesn't change power relations because it assumes that those in privilege and power should just remain there, and those who are down low should stay there, and that it's just, I'll just give you, 1% of my earnings or my income or my wealth or my land or my water or whatever, and this, fuck off.
Right off.
Fuck off. That's all I'm giving you. And then, I'm a hero or whatever, right? So that's the charity model. In Santa Barbara, California, where I live, the charity model is, I would say, for sure, the dominant model of social change. It's a very kind of class and race divided city, and it's sort of stereotypically so in that way. So solidarity means, so we're equal. So it's not, and maybe not like delusionally equal, but like I have your back and you have mine. And so what does that mean? So in a union context, like in our tenants union, we're getting, I think, increasingly a lot better with this. And I've heard tales from the old days of labor unions that this is how it would work. But let's say so-and-so member of your union. And when I say member, by the way, there's a good Jacobin thing on the nonprofit, NGOism is a great talk. And they were talking about how today's nonprofits, typically they'll talk about their membership, but they're really like mailing lists that they just say like, hey, we're doing an event, or hey, we need money from you or something, or hey, can you click stuff on our social media websites or whatever. But they're not really like membership in that sense is not, no one's expected to really be an active and democratically empowered. They don't play any actual role in the organization. There's a handful of staff who like foundation and government grant money pays to do stuff. I promise I'm going to come back to identity in a second. So membership organizations such as labor unions and a variety of others, tenants unions, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, that membership actually meant like you are an active, and Communist Party, Socialist Party, you are an active, when you're a member, you sign up, you pay some dues. Nobody pays too much, but you pay a little bit of money every month or whatever. And it helps pay for stuff that's just needed generally. And you come to the meetings and you're at least like maybe read the meeting minutes, or you read the pamphlets, or you keep up with whatever the association is involved in. And you're an active, it's almost like a new family. Like you're, okay, we're going to go out of state to visit so-and-so, auntie, whatever, just had a new baby. So we feel this sort of social obligation. We have to go and be in solidarity with her, even if like, we're kind of annoyed, her husband's kind of a dick, but we're going to go visit them anyway. So that's like solidarity in a family. This is kind of the way that unions once functioned. So in the identity sense, if you think of the way that solidarity, I think, is sort of imagined today, it's like, well, if we all change our default picture on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, we post Black Lives Matter things, we post Black Lives Matter signs on the homes that we own in suburban neighborhoods, we put bumper stickers on our cars, we like raise our fists up when you say, yeah, Rachel Maddow, Trump's racist and I love Mexicans or whatever. This shallow sense of like, you don't actually have the back of the oppressed person, and they don't have your back because you actually see them as below you to begin with. You don't think you're on even ground. And I think one of the huge consequences of the modern identity politic conversation is it's actually slotted. And this does go back to agreeing with Angie of the like this sort of, she didn't say permanent, but I would say permanent racialized subjects or permanent gender oppressed subjects or whatever, that there's actually this like permanent sense of disempowerment across identities. And if you look at any of the like general sort of diversity training kinds of things where they have these matrices where it's like the privileged ones are like white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, they have this whole slot and here's the oppressed people. I think that actually has ended up being this sort of like cognitive like brain worms for people and actually structurally unlearning and being opposed to actual solidarity, because what solidarity looks like is an example in our tenants union. Whether somebody's Latino or like homeless or like whatever, if they just bring up to us in our Slack workspace or a WhatsApp chat or a text message to us or a phone call to us, or if they bring up in the meeting that they're struggling in some way, every single person in the union, if they have the time and the ability, will show up for them in person. They will give them stuff. They will feed them. They will help them fill out the paperwork that they have to for court. They will help them find a lawyer. They will, if their bike was stolen, they'll say, well, let's see if we can scrounge some money together to get you a bike or whatever. So like the same way that you would do with a family member, you'd say, we need to make sure we take care of this person. So I wanted to go on that rant to say, to me, a sense of real solidarity and seeing that we are equals within, I think, frankly, it has to be mass organizations or even smaller federated organizations, because I don't really see it working in a more abstract sense where like I stand with Black people. Well, no, you don't. You can't. Like that's an abstract concept. You can't actually like abstractly be anti-racist. Like you can't be in solidarity with someone you don't have a relationship to and that you don't actually see as an equal member of the human race. Like it's actually like logistically impossible. So there's my sort of angry rant on, I think we need solidarity a lot more through, I guess it is class-based organization. It doesn't have to be class-based, but I just think, again, it's the easiest, simplest, most sort of like logically, it's just the easiest way to be in solidarity with other people. Cause like, why would you, yeah, okay, I'm done. If you have anything on that, I riled myself up with that.
I think solidarity is more, though, than being a personal helper to a person in your group. Because the reason you are a personal helper is because you've gone on activities together. You've figured out strategy together. You meet together. You plan together. You talk about your values together. And then if they need help with their rent or something, you do that together But that isn't the point. The point is that you share the value of class transformation in the United States. And that's particularly important because class has been racialized in the United States. A lot of white people think I can't be poor, I'm white. No, the mass of poor people in America are white. We are the majority and the majority of the poor and the majority of the people in jail and so on, even though blacks are many more than their proportion, many more in jail than the proportion of their population. But we have to see ourselves as in the same class boat from which we have to propel forward as a group, which does not deny that there is destructive racism, sexism, anti-sexual preference qualities, anti-Semitism, whatever.
Yeah, ableism, ageism, and it's like, fat phobia. Like there's probably like a new. I mean, the other thing is that I think it's hard in terms of, again, like relationship building with people. Like, let's just say, for example, I'm sure when you were coming up, Harriet, through the, 70s or 80s, it was like the gay rights movement. And now it's like LGBT, and LGBT is kind of like the standard thing, but then it became LGBTQ, and then it was LGBTQIA2S+. That's sort of like the most, like, I happen to know it because I'm weird and I actually read this stuff all the time. But like, no, most ordinary people, I don't want to go into that seemingly class reduction thing of just like, well, we shouldn't bother with all that stupid shit. Cause it's like, well, the queer community deserves to have like, again, like this sort of, it helps for us to have that solidarity, to like know a little bit about like, well, what's, what sort of culturally makes sense to this culture or whatever. Like, we don't have to be these like experts. Like, I know every single, like I could tell you the history of Juneteenth and all this stuff to show how much I care about Black people. And I can tell you what Two-Spirit means or something. I mean, I happen to know some of these things, but I think things have they've gotten, again, I want to say maybe alienation is the better word. I think there's a sort of derivative, the identity politic discourse has derived from a sense of extreme alienation under capitalism to where it's hard to actually make sense of it a lot of the time. I think outside of either like an abstract academic conversation or, again, the high conflict, like oppression Olympics fights that people have. Because, again, like, so we might say like, okay, so even the Combahee River Collective, I've read through their like entire statement before our recording today, because I was like, yeah, I just want to brush up on like the origin of this concept. And one of the things they touched on was that there's certain, so if you're Black and you're a woman and you're a lesbian, there's sort of like multiple, and this was like Crenshaw's intersectionality thing from, I think, like the 80s or 90s, like, and she brought it into sort of the legal realm, but it's like there's multiple sort of psychological, like psychic like harms being done to you like all the time. If you're like not just the X, but you're an X and a Y and a Z, like simultaneously. So you're experiencing not just sexism, but racism and homophobia. And so like, yeah, but I think the hard, again, going back to solidarity, it's really hard from an abstract point of view. Like for me as a white guy, or maybe let's say like a Latina lesbian, or like, I don't know, somebody that's not an X and a Y and a Z, to just have an abstract sense of like, man, there's just more psychic pain for that person. Like, I guess in my view, it almost starts to feel like this sort of sci-fi thing where you're just like imagining the people on another planet who have a certain hard life. Like, I'm skeptical of whether or not it helps anyone for people to build so much consciousness and awareness about these like complex statistical greater or lesser forms of suffering. Because again, like, does it lead to further solidarity or not? And like maybe it kind of leads to more solid, like maybe we get more bodies to the protest that says like trans Black lives matter, that like more like woke white people say like, oh, I totally get that because I've been reading like intersectional feminist literature or something. But I guess again, like I don't know, I'm not dissing protests, but like, we can't keep having just these one-offs of like showing, I don't know, I'm going to contradict myself and say maybe that is a form of solidarity in some ways, but I still feel like it's insufficient.
Limited. It's also, if you're constantly nitpicking PC in your this was politically incorrect, or that might be interpreted as a microaggression. We
Yeah.
won't fight the injustice that unites you.
Problematic would probably be the updated term, Harriet. I would say people would say it wouldn't say that's not PC. They'd say that's problematic. It's like almost a joke meme on the left. That's problematic. You're being problematic or whatever.
It's also divisive. If you are trying to win, and we have to face it, what all these groups have is they have, if they unite, we have numbers. They have the money, they have state power. We have the people who do the work to make everyone live. And without us, they're lost. And us is all of us. And we have to treat each other respectfully, absolutely. And the idea of micro divisions means you're going to lose. You know, I saw this banner at City College, Puerto Rican lesbians unite. And I thought, yeah, that's about 6 people in New York City.
Well, it's funny you say it's funny you say that, because the Combahee River Collective actually has a little paragraph on that. I'm not going to look it up, but it was like, we can't organize as lesbians alone or Black lesbians alone and stuff like that. It actually was saying, it was, I think, like the precursor to the intersectionality concept, that they were actually admitting that, like, if we actually go too far with identity, because they were coining the term identity politics, if we go too far, they didn't say if we go too far, but it'll be strategically ineffective for us to actually focus on those sort of subdivisions of oppressed identities. So, I mean, the source of the concept of identity politics, the original lesbian Black women were actually saying they think it's a bad idea.
Did what he did. And that's why both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, the 2 greatest leaders we've had in my lifetime, towards the end, before they were killed, said we need class unity. It isn't that King said, if you're going to win the race war, join unions. We have to be unified. And he died protesting. He was shot as he protested the sanitation workers' strike. And he joined them. And he started out joining the bus strike. And these people are lost if they don't unify, because what the workers of the world have in common is we do the work that keeps this society alive. And we have to stress the unity that we have, rather than, and welcome people identifying as a Black worker or a lesbian worker, but as a worker, joining with other workers. And if your whole political thrust is trolling for insults and status on victimhood, you're lost. You'll never win. So you'd have to be more interested in being politically correct than you are in winning to get too far along that path.
Well, let me ask you like an as a woman question, Harriet, because like I'm sure in your years you have experienced some sexism.
Oh, sure.
Am I correct?
What?
Where do you see, for example, how do I say it? Like when you experience sexism as a woman, and it's like, it's probably not even individual events, right? Again, this just goes back to like identity formation. Like we were saying earlier off air, of like this notion of like a woman might develop this sense of like, I always need to look pretty for men. I need to like not speak up when there's like men in the room and one of the things we talked about with Angie was, does the identity stuff go to class consciousness? And I was arguing that I don't think it's guaranteed. No. In fact, it can actually, it can be an impediment in some cases.
It certainly can.
So like, how do you reconcile that? Because when you talk about workers and stuff, there's probably so many people, probably not too many of our listeners, but a lot of people out there that are going to be so strongly identified with gender, race, ethnicity, cultural immigration status, disability, whatever. That's going to be their strongest identification point. And I mean, what do you think in terms of, because it seems like those things have to be maybe resolved is the wrong word, but people have to get comfortable in their own skin, right? Like if you're if you're being bombarded by sexism, or you're still kind of reeling from sexual assault trauma, and you're realizing that just like, wow, men are pigs, and it's, which like is kind of true. And or not like I'm not saying the Gloria Steinem thing, but it's just like sociologically, like, men, yeah, once you're a woman, you've experienced that stuff, and now you're like distrusting men left and right. What if it's harder for someone to say like, yeah, I'm a worker, I'm a tenant, I'm going to join with the, does that make sense to also sort of validate that side of when people are in that mode of identification? I mean,
on the other hand, if the people who are organizing a class-based movement address those things, so if you're addressing workers, you have to address the fact that only 3% of American women workers make $150,000 or more.
Yeah.
And 97 make less. And we have to make sure that pink-collar trades and pink-collar professions, all pink-collar jobs, are changed. That's why you'd support something like the infrastructure, the caring infrastructure, or Jacinda Ardern's whole thrust, which is to make the jobs of caring for people equivalent to any other jobs, which gave a over 30% increase across caring labor, whether they're nurses, whether they're therapists, whether they're home health care aides, whether they're nursery school teachers, all female jobs. So what you would do is you would say, we have to address this. Mm-hmm. These jobs are oppressive and exploitative, and they've pushed women into them as extensions of our exploitation at home, and we oppose exploitation.
What
That's
about,
we is everybody, not just the women's contingent.
Right. What about
we oppose sexism. We don't care who you want to make love to. That's your business. Our business is winning for all of us. And I think that's perfectly reasonable.
What do you think? Because I've gone back and forth on this too, where I used to be part of groups where they'd have like this preamble to their group or on their website or their Facebook page or something, and be like, we oppose racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, fatphobia, transphobia, racism, and I'd be like, oh man, like when I was a little bit younger, I'd be like, wow, they're radical as hell, man. And now it's like, I feel like it's almost like an HR like liability statement a little bit sometimes. Yes. But like I guess sometimes, because like I guess I've been thinking lately too about within like mass and membership based like class organizations, is it better to say that we oppose all the isms, or is it better to just have like a kind of across the board code of conduct agreement that can be addressed through some sort of just either organic social skills that people presumably are trying to cultivate as people that are social lists, or do you say, because here's the dilemma I see, like in our local DSA chapter, they're like, even on their website right now, like we're anti-racist, we're anti-sexist and stuff. And the thing that actually scares me at this point sometimes is I'm like, well, what if you're not? Because you're not, because I'm not actually always anti-racist and anti-sexist. Like I'm going to do racist, sexist stuff like later today, probably. Like that's like the society I grew up in. I'm probably going to say or do something that I didn't mean to. But what happens if you set that standard and then now people are looking for it? Because I've seen it now. It's like asking for it now a little bit, or it's like, we are this. And now it's like, okay, I'm going to hold you up to this purity test now.
Yeah, which is
you say that you're super anti-racist. And it's like,
the idea isn't to be pure. The idea is to unify and to win, not to be morally pure or pure in terms of chauvinism of any kind. But if you have a uniting voice, we are against all arbitrary divisions between people. We are against exploitation, where one person, aided by whatever works for them, whether it's sexism, racism, or anything else, exploits another person, takes from them without giving them the wealth they've created. We are against that. And we are unified against that. And that encompasses it all, because those are all arbitrary divisions between people. And the point is, we are against exploitation of any kind. And if people hurt each other's feelings, it ought to be addressed. And that isn't the purpose of our organization is not moral purity. The purpose is winning a just society. No one should be insulted. No one should be divided from anyone else on the basis of that crap, but only what they value, what they stand for, what they work for. And we're working together. That's a whole different thing from nitpicking and looking for insults and devolving into into moral purity and attack instead of unity against exploitation. And there, the repression of class and exploitation par excellence has put Americans so far back. Other countries like Germany, France, all of Scandinavia had powerful unions that outlawed outsourcing. So their millions of jobs weren't sent away. Ours were. We're in terrible shape. And because of that, and Americans' class has been repressed since the end of World War II and the anti-communist crusades.
Yeah.
And America was wealthy then because all the other economies were destroyed. And people didn't understand the extent to which this was temporary, as it is now, and as the mass of people are in terrible trouble. 1 in 4 kids doesn't even get enough to eat in this country.
Oh, you know what? I forgot. I would do want if anyone is still listening, so I don't think people usually listen all the way through, but I totally forgot to bring up earlier because here's another flip side, because I'm playing I'm the opposite of a class reductionist today. I think I'm doing decently well. That there's a great book. I'm not as much into it now, but it shaped my thinking a lot years ago, called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race." It's the longest book title ever. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria by Beverly Tatum. It is a book that talks a lot about racial identity development, specifically amongst black kids and other people of color. And Tatum, a clinical psychologist woman who's black, had written it because in the many schools where she worked, she was getting asked by white teachers all the time that exact question: why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? I think this was in the 90s. Maybe I'm mistaken, but it was it wasn't like Obama post-racial time, but there was just this question, segregation's over, why would people self-segregate like that? I feel like it's kind of intuitive at this point, right? People know why, hang out with people that you kind of like and trust and whatever. But one of the more interesting things, there's a whole chapter, if I remember correctly, on white racial identity development. So I do think this is actually kind of important on the psychology front. If you're just I'm a very online white socialist leftist person and class worker, I think it is actually good to have some mindfulness around how you have been shaped in the dominant position, whiteness in particular. I think men, maybe cisgender straight people kind of stuff, but I think primarily, especially if you're a white guy, to actually look into, because Tatum had this exercise in her developmental psychology class. She'd ask people to write. I think there's flaws with this intervention, but I'll just take it on good faith. Write a sentence that says, "I am blank," and do it 10 times on a page. And then people would stand up and say that, right? And so the black people, the women, the other people of sort of more marginalized identities would usually have their marginalized identity in the blank spot at some place in the 10-item list. Most white people would not have white, and most men would not have man. And one of the things that she was sort of anecdotally uncovering there, and I think there's a little bit of quasi-quantitative, soft psychology data on this, but that those of us in that dominant cultural position don't tend to think that we have, say, a race or a gender, unless that more unconscious part of our identity is threatened, and then it comes out that we very much are white and we very much are a man. So I might not be walking around, I might say "Oh, why are there all these dresses in this shop, man?" But I'm not saying everything should be for men, but I'll have that so-called fragile masculinity be sort of tried. And as a white person, I might say, well, why, I don't know. Yeah. Why is it's only people that speak Spanish in this damn taqueria or something? I mean, I guess that's not necessarily racist. It's just sort of culturally ignorant. But there are things that will bring out these there's moments where I think other people of other marginalized identities can kind of see the internalized entitlements that have been shaped
Yes, they
into, say,
can.
people like, yeah. Okay.
However,
All
the
right.
blue collar worker who now is reduced to minimum wage won't identify as I am a blue collar worker, but it's nonetheless an oppressed identity, robbed of its dignity in this country because it isn't noticed. People notice who's black, they notice who's a woman. But class identity is so repressed that people don't notice.
Well, yeah, and well, actually, the last thing, so I forgot to say this at the end of that thing, was that the recommendation by Beverly Totem is for white people in particular to start doing research on who were the white anti-racists through history. Like John Brown's an example, and he's like,
Yes.
he was insane. Like he led a slave revolt. He was a rifleman or something, and he like led a slave revolt, or not led it. He helped organize as a white guy, right? That was being given that economic and newly racialized title of white, where he was just going to be guaranteed extra shit for no reason. And he was like, that's wrong. So he was a militant abolitionist who said, let's go kill the fucking slavers. Let's go kill them. Let's have an armed insurrectionary revolt on the plantation. And then let's, I don't know if there were really plans beyond that, but there's many other examples.
He hoped other slaves would get the idea.
Really? Okay. He hoped it would kind of catch on and go viral. But like Totem just gives examples where she's like, for white people that don't even see themselves as having a race, it might be helpful for you to start internalizing the concept of like, I'm someone who actually opposes racism. I think it's a trash fire mistake of society, and I actually am going to find ways to oppose it. She doesn't talk about class, and that's my main issue with the book, because it is kind of like an identity reductionist kind of view. But I think that concept is important, and same with men. Like, can we as say white men or men generally or white people generally actually think of people either in history books or in our lives where like that is the model white person, that is a model black, man that is not particularly sexist or racist or whatever interpersonally. And I think also that, like, as you brought up, Harriet, like if we thought back, if I knew more about, say, the Communist Party of the 1930s, I could probably think of all kinds of white people that were organizing with black people for class struggle. It's just that I haven't really been exposed to that because the education system never even told me there was a such thing as a communist party. Like I didn't know that until like the last 2 years that we had a thriving communist party in the U.S.
Yeah, we don't learn about the united white and black tenant farmers of the South.
Right.
Who burned the plantation houses and fought together. It was a huge struggle organized by the Communist Party. That is not what we learn about in school. And I think white men would be really smart to think about how emotionally repressed they are and how an awful, horrible identity robs them of their emotional versatility and their emotional validity and their vulnerability as humans. And I think that people should think about how those arbitrary divisions divide us from a sense of community with each other and the world, and how denied we all are, rather than those poor darkies, they're so denied. Now, it is true, economically, black people have been horribly oppressed. The brief period of Reconstruction was too brief after the Civil War. However,
and white terrorism just destroyed all the progress. Right. Yeah, and
Jim Crow reasserted itself. Right. However, we also could think about our own oppression and identify, because you don't live in this society without it. Even very rich people are separate. They're separate. And they're in another category and isolated from other people and on the defensive because on some level they know it was stolen. And I think if people are more emotionally in touch with their own oppression from being disunited from other people and from their own common humanity and their own internal feelings, they'll be united much better. At any rate, we should stop.
We should stop.
And we love comments from our listeners as well, as we love people to join.
Yeah. we haven't had an email in a while. I don't know if that means that they're just like, yep, I'll get it, or if they're like, I have nothing to say to these people, or if it's just what it is. But people,
Yeah.
I think in the beginning, I don't know what it is, but in the beginning, we we're getting emails all the time, like, your podcast this needs to be talked about and stuff. Maybe we've just kind of like started to suck a lot or something. I think that's totally possible. But anybody that, please, I also think like these discussions, we wanted to have a sort of identity wrap up. I was telling Harriet, like, I feel like I'm so over talking about, and especially this critical of identity politics thing, I was starting to feel kind of icky personally. Like, I think we're kind of, I think these phrases are so stupid. Like class reductionist is such a stupid term, but I know what it's trying to get across, this sort of denial of the micro granular, sort of psychic harms across identity, whatever. So I'm glad we got to kind of get this out. I'm sure we will talk about it again because it does, this is a really important topic that does intersect into all the different issues that matter in the world. But we wanted to, for now, kind of wrap this up. But if anybody did want to just comment on this topic or even join the podcast at some point to get into this more, because I don't know. This isn't going to be the end to our conversation on identity politics.
No, but we want feedback. The bottom line is give us feedback so we know where we're going in terms of reaching you. And we thank you enormously for listening, and we'll thank you even more for giving us feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. So to do that, it's not just in your head at gmail.com. And if you want to become a patron and support the podcast and join our monthly reading groups and our Discord chat and all that crap, go to patreon.com/it's not just in your head.
Okay.
Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.